Right.
It's all yours, Eric.
Well, we didn't decide who was going to actually introduce you, Lucinda, and I think you've pretty much introduced yourself. Everybody knows you, but
I can
just in
introduce
case
myself.
anyone doesn't, Lucinda is currently president of the Dickens Fellowship, and let me get this right, she's the great granddaughter of someone you may have heard of, Charles Dickens.
Yes, and Catherine as well. She had a bit of a part to play in that. Thank you very much. Yeah, great granddaughter. Easiest way is to say triple great. Whenever I see Mark or Ian or Gerald, I say you're just double great. I'm triple great. Makes it even better. And now we've
Lucinda's
got
written very many books, but you've written specifically on Dickens and Christmas, Victorian Christmas. So we hope you're going to develop that with us to see.
I am. I'm so sorry about these sirens. There must be something major. Whatever's happening in London tonight, you're hearing it here first.
well, Lucinda, I'm going to mute everybody now.
Okay, and I'll share my screen.
You'll have to share your screen and unmute yourself, probably. Okay. So if you unmute yourself, Lucinda, there we go.
Yeah, unmuted. Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to talk tonight about Victorian Christmas, and this is a very different book from anything that I've written previously, because the publisher came to me with the idea for it. And as you can see, it's got recipes, decorations, all those kind of things in it. And it was really fun to get the chance to do this. Now, most of the research had come from my book research I'd done for Dickens and Christmas. But it was just really good to look at the history of Christmas. So although it's actually called Victorian Christmas, it starts with looking at what was happening beforehand. And when we get to the Victorians, we have centuries and centuries of celebration, not just of Christmas, but of midwinter festivals, the solstice, and predating Christianity, predating even the Roman invasion of Britain, the idea of celebrating that middle point of winter in the hopes that you would bring the harvest, the good weather, the summer back again. So it was really interesting to look at that whole history. Now, the very first mention of a man symbolising Christmas can be dated back to a carol from the 1400s. And this was where Sir Christmas in the carol tells the listeners that the baby Jesus has been born and exhorts Christians to make good cheer and be right merry. And then a contemporary of Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, he was asked in 1616 by the royal household to create a festive play for the royal court. And it was entitled Christmas His Mask, spelt M-A-S-Q-U-E. And one of the characters is a personification of Christmas. He is named both Old Christmas and Old Gregory Christmas, a name that seems to have completely fallen out. He's described as being dressed, I love this because he sounds a bit more like Malvolio than Father Christmas as we might recognise him. He's dressed in round hose, long stockings, a close doublet and high-crowned hat with a brooch, little ruffles, white shoes, his scarves and his garters tie crossed. And he's also described as having a long, thin beard. Several of his children appear in the play and they all have fabulous names. And these include Mince Pie, Carol, okay, fair enough, Wassail, Mumming and New Year's Gift. I think of all of those, I'd imagine the only one of those names that's still used today is Carol. Now, and then we get on to the Puritans banning Christmas. So here we have an early illustration of Father Christmas in the middle saying, "Oh, sir, I bring good cheer." And there is the Puritan on my left saying, "Keep out, you come not here." And then Old Christmas, welcome, do not here. So this is the working man, the non-Puritan, the people of Britain who do want to celebrate Christmas. And this was the cover, this cartoon was used as the cover for a pamphlet that was written in 1652, so right in the heart of the kind of whole Civil War. John Taylor, who was a boatman, a Thames boatman in London, and he was furious about the ban on Christmas because, as you may or may not know, the Puritans really banned all the fun things about Christmas. The only thing that people were allowed to do to mark Christmas was to go to church. And when you went to church, there was no music, absolutely no singing, no dancing, no fine clothes, no special foods, no proper reference to it being Christmas other than going to a very somber church service. Then you went back to work. You were not expected to have the day off work. You couldn't dress up. You weren't supposed to eat Christmas foods. They were banned. You might be aware, those of you in California, that the big thing here is often mince pies. And they were seen as blasphemous because the original mince pies, the pastry case was meant to symbolize Jesus's cradle. And then there was the mincemeat. And then on top, there was a little pastry figure of a baby. So it was meant to be baby Jesus in his cradle, surrounded by mincemeat. And this was seen as very blasphemous, eating the baby Jesus. So mince pies were banished. Decorating your homes were banished. Any greenery being brought into the house, which was a very, very old tradition indeed. All of those things were banned by the Puritans. So John Taylor, this Thames boatman, created this pamphlet called The Vindication of Christmas, and it defended the people's right to celebrate Christmas with traditional activities. And he included these roasting apples, playing cards, singing carols, and dancing, as well as many other things. So when the Puritans kind of ousted, when the monarchy came back to the throne in 1660, in England at least, Christmas started to be celebrated again. Now, I know there's lots of Scots here, so it was a very, very different story. Up in Scotland, I know that Christmas was celebrated very differently for centuries. But the way that that Christmas was celebrated throughout all of these early years started to come through to the Victorian times, when people wanted to look at all the old traditions and make Christmas really much more exciting than it had been for a while. Now, after the Puritans, some years later, we get the Hanoverians. Now, of course, they had German ancestry, or they were German, and they brought their German ideas of Christmas to Britain. But what they didn't do was share them with everybody else. So the idea of the Christmas tree, for example, was something that was known about in the royal household, but nowhere else. And then Queen Charlotte, the wife of King George III. Now, she grew up in Germany, but she had North African and Portuguese ancestry. And she brought with her the tradition of having the yew bough that was brought into the house, and the presents were hidden underneath it. So this big branch was laid on a table and then decorated. As Samuel Taylor Coleridge wrote back to his wife when he visited Germany, he wrote back and he said that they were decorated with lighted tapers or candles and fluttering streamers of paper and ribbon. Can you imagine what a fire hazard that is? Absolutely do not try that at home. But she had this within her house, but she also had a decorated Christmas tree. And she decided that she wanted to show all the children of the royal household, not just the royal family, but the children of the servants, the children of the ladies in waiting, and all the kind of equerries and diplomats. She wanted them to be able to see the joy that was a Christmas tree. So it slowly started to spread out. She produced this Christmas tree, and all the children in the household came in and they were given sugar plums and all sorts of wonderful gifts. And this then became the very fashionable thing to do in the aristocracy. But it didn't filter through for some time to everybody else in Britain. And I'll tell you a bit more about that later on. Now we get on to another queen here. This is Queen Victoria's 12th cake. So here we are firmly in the Victorian age. This was the illustration that was used in the London papers in 1851 to show Queen Victoria's 12th cake. Now, when Charles Dickens was a child, the Christmas cake did not exist. What one had was the 12th cake created for Twelfth Night. Now, in this particular one, it's described as having ribbons down the side, and these little figures on top are holding glasses that it says proudly, they're not sugar crafted, they're actual miniature glassware. But usually they would have actually created all these things with sugar, edible things. It was extraordinary. They would have whole scenes on the top, a bit like a painting on a 12th cake. And as you may know, with the Dickens family, Charlie Dickens' birthday was on 12th night, the 6th of January, and his godmother was Angela Burdett Coutts. And every year she would send the Dickens family a fabulous 12th cake. And even the year that they were in Genoa in Italy, in 1845, when Charlie had his birthday in 1845, Angela Burdett Coutts amazed the family by managing to get a 12th cake out to them on time for his birthday, undamaged all the way to Genoa. Now, confectioners at this time and bakers would produce these marvellous cakes, and they were a real showcase of their talent and they would be put in the shop window. So a bit like today, you might go to London or to New York or wherever to see the fabulous Christmas windows. And this would be what the confectioners would do with their 12th cakes. And of course, in France, they have the same thing on the 6th of January. They have the galette de roi, the king's cake, where it still follows on this tradition. So all of these traditions associated with Christmas were things that Dickens grew up celebrating. There's this extraordinary belief that Dickens invented Christmas, which of course isn't true. In fact, I had quite a funny phone conversation yesterday with a journalist who rang me up and said, I wanted to ask you about the difficulties that Dickens had writing A Christmas Carol. And I said, oh, well, do you mean the financial difficulties? Because he wrote it amazingly fast in just 6 weeks. Oh, I've seen the movie of the man who invented Christmas, and it looked like he had a really hard time writing it. So I point out that that is entirely fictional. But people like to think that with A Christmas Carol, he invented the celebration of Christmas. But all of these things that we see, particularly like Fezziwig's Ball, these were the Christmases that Dickens grew up with. And Jane Austen's niece, Annie Austen Knight, she described the Twelfth Night ceremonies that took place in 1809, so 3 years, of course, before Dickens was born, at the seat of her uncle Edward Knight, which was Godmersham Park. She said, after dessert, Aunt Louisa, who was the only one to know the characters, took one by one out of the room, and having equipped them, put them into separate rooms and lastly dressed herself. We were all conducted into the library and performed our different parts. So they all played different roles. And this was, you were given a particular role, and if you were eating a 12th cake, you would receive a token in each slice of cake that would denote whether you were the king or the queen, the slob, I love that one, you were the page, all of these different things, and you got to act that part for the whole day, or in this case, by 1809, this was for the evening. Her mother was a shepherdess. One of the other guests was an orange woman, presumably an orange seller. She was a fortune teller, Jane Austen's niece. And I love the fact that this was how they enjoyed their 12th night celebrations. So Dickens would have grown up with all of these traditions. The Christmas cake itself didn't appear until the 1860s. The first known recipe for Christmas cake that was published was in Mrs. Beeton's book of household management, which was, of course, nearly a decade after Catherine Dickens wrote her own guide for young wives. I always feel that Mrs. Beeton didn't quite let people know, all those precursors, Catherine Dickens and Eliza Acton as well. Now, Eliza Acton, who wrote this wonderful book called Modern Cookery for Private Families, she had produced her cookbook in 1845, 2 years after A Christmas Carol. And she included in that 3 recipes for Christmas pudding. And it makes me laugh because they've all got different ingredients, different kind of levels of luxury. And the most simple one with the poorest ingredients is called the author's Christmas pudding, which always makes me laugh. So then as now, authors weren't expected to come up with, to have that much money at Christmas. Now, after the death of Prince Albert in 1861, Queen Victoria retired largely from public life. She very reluctantly came out to do things, and she was fed up with the 2 weeks of Christmas that Dickens so loved, beginning on Christmas Eve, the 24th of December, and ending on the 6th of January, 12th night. And she decided that this was a completely un-Christian celebration. There was a lot of kind of revelry. There was lots of people, getting drunk and dancing and taking time off work. She wasn't as bad as Cromwell, but she was, feeling a bit puritanical about it all. And she really tried to truncate the Christmas period. And by the end of Queen Victoria's reign, Christmas had really shrunk to, in England at least, 24th, 25th and 26th, Boxing Day. And most people work on Christmas Eve, but kind of begin Christmas Eve in the evening with church and then carry on to Boxing Day, or the 26th of December, for those of you in the US who probably don't celebrate Boxing Day. Now, this is something that Cindy knows very, very well. I'm going to tell a little story that Cindy told me, actually, that when the Lost Portrait was on display in the museum, she would always enter and say, "Good morning, Mr. Dickens." And I love that because it's so true that when you see this portrait, and I hope some of you have had the pleasure of seeing it in person at the museum, it's not on display for very long because it has real conservation needs. So it's usually just on display for about 1 month in the year. And it was at the beginning of this year in the exhibition. But this is exactly how Dickens looked when he was writing A Christmas Carol. And that's one thing I find incredibly special about The Lost Portrait. And painted by the brilliant Scottish artist, in fact, Margaret Gillies. So all of you in Scotland can feel very proud of her. And I love the way that Dickens is looking out intently, as if he's looking at Margaret Gillies. And as we know, she had illustrated what is known as the Blue Book, the report that her partner, Dr. Thomas Southwood Smith, had created into children's employment, particularly in mines. She had gone down into the mines and seen the terrible conditions and drawn illustrations of these to show people the awful conditions of this. And of course, as we know, in A Christmas Carol, Scrooge is taken with the ghost of Christmas Present and he actually sees miners. And I like to think that Margaret Gillies, in telling him her stories, reminded him of the places that he'd been to in Cornwall and encouraged him to put those miners into A Christmas Carol. So what did A Christmas Carol do for the Victorian Christmas? What did the Romans ever do for us? What did A Christmas Carol ever do for Christmas? Well, when I was researching Dickens and Christmas, I looked at the newspaper reports from the 1810s, 20s, 30s, and beginning of 1840s. And again, there are editorials and articles about how Christmas has lost its meaning. Christmas is just not the same as it used to be. The poor aren't being helped. Nobody is thinking about what they should be doing. All they're thinking about is, we need to have the most fabulous parties. We need to know about which duchess has hosted the most elaborate soiree. And we need to think about the feasting and the presents and not think about the poor. Now, this is Margaret Gillies, who created The Lost Portrait. And she was there at a time when Dickens had just come back from visiting his sister in Manchester and had witnessed the kind of poverty that even possibly more than he'd seen in London, because this is the 1840s. This is what historians now refer to as the hungry 40s. And Dickens had seen in Manchester the number of people who had come over from Ireland. Now, the big Irish famine was still a couple of years away, but there were already failing harvests and a huge amount of poverty and terrible conditions of Irish people by, sadly, often English landowners. And so many people were travelling to England to get away from that, but then living on the streets because it was the Industrial Revolution, but it was the time of the Industrial Revolution when the machines had started to take over. And people were suddenly finding that there wasn't enough work for them. So it's a little bit like today with AI. I mean, it's a really similar kind of thing, taking over works. So Margaret Gillies was talking to Dickens about her campaigning work, and he had looked at this. This is the report. These are the illustrations that Margaret Gillies had produced anonymously, because nobody must know that this was an upper middle class woman who'd been down and seen these conditions. And her lover, Dr. Thomas Southwood Smith, had got Dickens involved in this campaign. So he's read this book, gone to Manchester, witnessed poverty, and he knew that he needed to write something that was going to make a change. Now, initially, he had talked to Dr. Thomas Southwood Smith about writing a pamphlet, a non-fiction pamphlet, but he realised that just wasn't going to be as hard-hitting. And I often wonder if it's because American Notes had come out the previous year, and Dickens had seen that when he wrote non-fiction, people just weren't as interested. Travel writing was a fairly new genre, and they didn't really get it. And I think he just thought, these scenes, I mean, this, when you look at this here, this is the illustration. The following represents an older girl carrying coals. This is another of Margaret Gillies' illustrations. These are the things that Dickens was looking at. This is not an old woman. This is a girl. And these are the things that Dickens wanted to bring to his readers. So when he wrote A Christmas Carol, he said he wanted to strike a hammer blow in favour of the poor man's child. All of these things were in his mind. But it also went on to have an extraordinary effect, not only on Dickens's career, but on the ways in which Christmas was perceived and indeed celebrated. Now, we have a pure coincidence that happens in December of 1843. Not only did Dickens publish A Christmas Carol, which, a quick reminder that Chapman and Hall, his publishers, thought that a book about Christmas was a really uncommercial idea. So they didn't think anyone would want to read it, and they made him pay for the expensive illustrations that John Leech was producing because he wanted them hand tinted, which of course in an age before colour printing, that meant, individual artists working on them. And so we know that Dickens had this belief in this book, but his publishers didn't. They were wrong, he was right. And in the same year, this happened. Now this is the very first Christmas card that was ever produced commercially. This is in the Victorian and Albert Museum in London. And here we see Henry Cole seated in the middle in his rather grand waistcoat with his family, all drinking wine, including this little child at the front, you can see, being helped to their wine. The Temperance Society went absolutely bananas about this. What were they doing? Showing people drinking, including young children. But look at the side here. I want you to look at the side. These are two illustrations of acts of charity, giving warm clothing and food to people in need. This was what everyone had been saying since the 18th century. Christmas had lost its meaning. And these two illustrations also show what Dickens brought into A Christmas Carol, the idea that all his readers were a bit like Ebenezer Scrooge. Every one of them needed to think about the way that they helped or didn't help the poor and their attitudes towards people. So with these two things happening at the same time, they were capturing the zeitgeist. Christmas was absolutely ripe for a renaissance. Henry Cole, by the way, was a very busy civil servant. He would go on to become the director of the South Kensington Museum. But at this point, he was a busy civil servant who just didn't have time to, the South Kensington Museum, by the way, we now call the V&A, Victorian Albert Museum. But he didn't have the time to write the requisite Christmas letter to all of his friends, family, work colleagues. So he asked an artist friend, a man called John Callcott Horsley, Horsley, if he would create this image. And then he had 1,000 copies printed, and those that he didn't use, he sold. I think they were £1 each, which was a huge amount of money. So they were not commercially successful, but it began the craze for commercially produced Christmas cards. And something I like about John Callcott Horsley is his name is much better known to art historians by the nickname of Clothes Horsley. And this is because he was totally against the use of naked models in life drawing classes. He didn't understand why people couldn't just paint people with their clothes on. Why did art students need to learn from the nude? He was very cross about it. And he tried to start this campaign to prevent schools like the Royal Academy from allowing their pupils to paint and draw from the naked figure. He lost, but he became known by the nickname Clothes Horsley as a result. So that's probably what he's best known for today, but he should be best known for this card. Now, this is Eliza Acton's book, as I mentioned, that includes the very first recipes for a Christmas pudding. So suddenly things are starting to happen. 1843, we've got A Christmas Carol, and we've got Henry Cole's Christmas card. 1844, The Chimes, and in 1844, so many other Christmas books as well. And here we have Eliza Acton's Modern Cookery for Private Families. I have a feeling that had she lodged a plagiarism case against Mrs. Beeton, she possibly could have won at the time, because there's a lot of Eliza Acton's book in Mrs. Beeton's book, allegedly. And then we have this chap the following year. Now, this is him some years later. This is him in the 1860s. But in 1848, this young man, Tom Smith, who was a very young baker and confectioner from London, went off to Paris, and he bought some bonbons. And these bonbons were wrapped up in this kind of crinkly paper, and they made a kind of crackling sound. And he decided this might be a fun Christmas thing to produce. And this was the very beginning of the Christmas cracker. Now, it evolved over the years. It didn't instantly grow fully formed with a hat and a motto and everything else, but he started to create different versions of it. Excuse me. And by the 1860s, it had these little snaps in it that would actually make a full bang rather than just the crackling paper. And you might find if you buy Christmas crackers now, they might be made by the company Tom Smith, because it still bears his name. So all of these things were happening while Dickens was still writing his 5 Christmas books. And then in 1848, this happened. Prince Albert decided that he would show not just the children of the royal household, but everybody, what the royal family did at Christmas. Now, this illustration of the royal family around a decorated Christmas tree, which looks rather magnificent, appeared in the Illustrated London News and other newspapers as well. And the Illustrated London News, by the way, went all around the world. And what Prince Albert had done was he'd also asked for a decorated Christmas tree to be placed in the courtyard at Windsor Castle. And that meant that, and then he invited the press as well, that meant that everybody local could see it. He also sent Christmas trees, complete with footmen to decorate them, to the local barracks and to the local school, which just happened to be Eton, you know, because all those school children at Eton really needed royal patronage. They didn't have very much. And so we have the Christmas tree suddenly being shown to everybody. When I wrote my biography of Princess Louise, I was fascinated by Prince Albert. He's such an interesting man, and I think he's often forgotten in British history because Queen Victoria lived for 40 years longer than he did, and she was such a kind of dynamic, powerful figure. But he was such an interesting man. He was hugely in support of the education of the people. So the South Kensington Museums in London, the V&A, the Science Museum and the Natural History Museum all grew out of Prince Albert's idea to educate the public. And much of what he did was to try and bring information not only to those in their privileged positions, the royal household, but out to everybody. He wanted to have a non-ignorant populace. And he and Dickens got to know each other. There's a lovely story that when Charles Dickens was on holiday in France with his family and Prince Albert was visiting Napoleon III, Dickens was out walking early one morning and Napoleon III and Prince Albert were walking along and they passed each other and Prince Albert took off his hat to Dickens. That shows to me how this little boy, this little labouring hind, as Dickens described himself, had risen to become perceived as the equal of the Prince Consort and the ruler of France. And Dickens and Prince Albert, I think, must have got on very well when they met, because they did actually have quite a lot in common. I don't say that I know that, but I just think they would have had a lot in sympathy. Now, when I was researching Dickens and Christmas, I went to the Museum of London, where they have information about Christmases throughout history. And one of the things that I loved there was a notebook written by a young woman called Amelia, and she was the daughter of a butcher in Walthamstow in East London, so not from a wealthy family. And she was about to get married and she was keeping a diary of her kind of engagement year. And one thing she wrote at Christmas was that she had been out and bought calico to make a Christmas tree for the children next door. So the vast majority of early Christmas trees were not people bringing Christmas trees into their home and decorating them. It was making them, collecting twigs, collecting branches when you were out walking, tying them together, or making them from strips of paper or strips of material. And I just think what a lovely thing that is, that people were physically making their own Christmas trees. Now, these are not the very earliest, but these are some vintage examples of Christmas baubles. In 1847, a German man named Hans Greiner from the glass-making town of Lauscha in Germany, he started making little glass ornaments in the shape mostly of fruit and nuts to be hung on Christmas trees. But he'd started creating a new method of making the glass that gave it this silvery look, which shone beautifully with all the Christmas tree candles. And these started to be exported very quickly all over the place. And of course, Britain and Germany had such close connections with the royal family being German that there were a lot of people bringing them over from Germany. However, in the 1880s, an American shop owner was also in Germany and he visited the town of Lauscha, and his name just happened to be F.W. Woolworth. So these ended up being all over America and hugely popular. Very early on, by the way, pre-Victorian times, people would use apples to decorate trees. And these were called paradise trees. They were out, particularly in medieval Europe, they were very popular. Usually outside, people weren't bringing trees into their home at this point. And this is because the feast day of Adam and Eve was the 24th of December. And that again morphed into decorating your Christmas tree. My parents had apples that they'd been given that would go on their Christmas tree. And I could never quite understand why. And I then discovered it was because of this ancient tradition of decorating the paradise tree. So we've had all of these years from 1845 to 1848. And of course, in that time, Dickens has also written 4 more Christmas books. Now, what A Christmas Carol did, as well as making him change his publisher, because Chapman and Hall didn't have enough, they didn't have enough confidence in Dickens. But what this did was to make every other publisher and every other author want to create a Christmas book. So 1843 was the last time that Dickens was able to write a Christmas book without being surrounded by other people doing exactly the same. And I think we can look at this as being the origin of all those Christmas blockbuster films, even perhaps Christmas #1 singles, all the kind of Christmas specials on TV. these can all be traced back to A Christmas Carol and the fervour around Christmas that this began. Now, you might recognise this woman, Elizabeth Gaskell, and she wrote a rather wonderful story in 1848, the same year in which Dickens produced his last, and in my opinion, the second best Christmas book, The Haunted Man. I love The Haunted Man. It's a fantastic story. And in the same year, Elizabeth Gaskell produced a short story called Christmas Storms and Sunshine. It's a kind of satirical but very warm-hearted tale, and if you haven't read it, I would recommend it. And I wanted to read to you a little bit of it, because the opening paragraph, particularly for those of us in the UK, but I think actually for people in the States as well at the moment, this is the opening paragraph written in 1848, and the story is about two sets of neighbours, two couples who do not get on at all. Both of the husbands are journalists, and they don't get on. And it begins with a description of the newspapers on which the two husbands work. The Flying Post was long established and respectable, alias bigoted and Tory. The Examiner was spirited and intelligent, alias newfangled and democratic. I mean, it's just such a fabulous description of the kind of political division that's going on in so much of the world today. And this is Gaskell writing in 1848. Now, the two wives also don't get on. So Mrs. Hodgson has a baby, and unfortunately her neighbour, Mrs. Jenkins, is childless and not happy about being childless. But she has a cat who she absolutely adores. And when the cat breaks into the Hodgsons' home and steals the food, Mrs. Hodgson beats Mrs. Jenkins' cat. And this is a huge feud between them. But then the Hodgsons' baby gets ill, and Mrs. Jenkins helps to save its life. So by the end of the story, the two couples are sitting down together and pooling their food, so they're having a shared Christmas meal. And of course, it's exactly what every Victorian wanted to see. And then we get on to Wilkie Collins. One of my other favourite Dickens Christmas stories is the fabulously melodramatic, of course, it was co-written with Wilkie Collins here, story No Thoroughfare of 1867. I do a Dickens and Christmas walk around London. In fact, I did it last night online for those who can't get to London. And one of the things I was thinking is, when am I going to, on this particular route, when am I going to talk about No Thoroughfare? Because, you know, Wilkie Collins doesn't have a plaque or anything along this route. And then I discovered that in Lincoln's Inn Fields, where I take people to see John Forster's house and talk about the first reading of the chimes, on the other side of Lincoln's Inn Fields, there is a sign that says No Thoroughfare. Thought, well done. Somebody was looking down on me and put that there. If you haven't read No Thoroughfare, or if you haven't read it for a long time, I'd really recommend rereading it. It's a really fun one. And of course, it goes back to one of Dickens's earliest influences, the Foundling Hospital, which he'd walked past all the time when he was writing Oliver Twist. And he talks about two foundlings who've both been given the same name and the complications that ensue. It's a great story, and if you haven't read it, do give it a read, because it's really wonderful. Now, we're going to go back to A Christmas Carol for a bit, because here we have one of those hand-tinted illustrations of which Dickens was so fond and which Chapman and Hall weren't initially, by the great John Leech, who would go on later, largely as a result of his fame from working on A Christmas Carol, to become one of the top cartoonists for Punch. I particularly love this one. I mean, you don't really see Father Christmas walking around with his chest bare like this, though I will actually say the exception being Galveston, Texas, the Dickens Festival there is a man who walks around. He obviously spends a lot of time at the gym. He's very proud of himself. And he does walk around in a robe open like this. But it's the only time I've ever seen Father Christmas dressed in quite this way. But here, this illustration encapsulates so much of Victorian thinking. So if we take aside Scrooge and all the food and everything else and just look at this image of the man, we have a definite echo of Jesus Christ in the hair and the beard and even the crown. That's very much a Christian iconography used there. And then we have the ancient pagan figure, pre-Christianity in Britain, of the Green Man. You may have passed pubs in Britain called the Green Man with an image of a face that looks very like this. The reason why, long before the Romans arrived and used the Midwinter Festival to turn it into Saturnalia, and then Christianity turned that into Christmas, long before then you'd have seen people bringing in greenery just as the Green Man represented, to try and bring that kind of midwinter good luck into the home. But we also have, of course, the green and white robes, which Victorian children would absolutely have recognised as being emblematic of Father Christmas. Now, we tend to think of Father Christmas, or in America, Santa Claus, as being dressed in red and white. But in the 19th century, there are barely any representations of Father Christmas dressed in red and white, maybe a couple. There's some occasionally of him in a kind of claret colour, a kind of burgundy colour and white, occasionally brown and white, but it's almost always green and white or blue and white. And this is an evocation of Father Christmas as well. One of my favourite sections of A Christmas Carol is during this episode, when Scrooge stops being Scrooge the miser and he becomes Charles Dickens the campaigner. I'm wondering if any of you think about the bit I'm talking about. It's one of my favourite bits, and it's when they're flying around and the ghost is kind of, sprinkling the special thing from his torch to make people's dinners taste good and to stop people fighting. And they're looking at the line of people waiting to go into the baker's shops, because poor people could not afford to have an oven in their home. They might have a fire if they were lucky to have firewood, but most people didn't have an oven to cook in. And so what did they do? They would put all their ingredients in a pot and take them to the baker's shops, because the baker's shops would have these big, big ovens that had to stay hot for a long time. But when they'd finished their baking for the day, the ovens would stay hot for quite a long time, and people could pay a small amount of money and put their cooking pot into the ovens with everybody else's and cook their meals. Now, of course, for most people, they were working 6 days a week. Sunday was their only day when they might have been able to put together a hot meal. And there was a move by the church to close down bakers' shops on a Sunday, because it was blasphemous to have the bakers' shops open and cooking on a Sunday. And Scrooge suddenly says, very much in the voice of Dickens, to the ghost, "So why do you seek to close these places on a Sunday, the only day in the week in which a poor person can be said to dine at all?" And the ghost very much becomes Jesus Christ and says, "It might be done in my name, but it's not of my choosing." And I love that role reversal for Scrooge, from Scrooge to Dickens. Probably an editor today would say, you can't have that kind of character change in the middle of a character. But it's just this marvellous moment where Dickens is saying to his readers, Sunday Christians are not what the poor needs. We need people who care about the poor 7 days a week and are concerned about their welfare. Anyway, we're going to go back to this being an image of Father Christmas and go on to the earliest illustration in America. And I always have to look up this chap, Norwegian American called, sorry, no, that's the latest one. This is the first illustration of Santa Claus by Thomas Nast in Harper's Weekly. And Harper's Weekly showed this in January, the 3rd of January, 1863. Here we have an image of how Americans would have seen Santa Claus. Now, I can't speak Dutch, so I apologise if there's any Dutch speakers here, but people always want to know, how did Father Christmas become Santa Claus? And that is because in as early as the 1600s, with the colony of New Amsterdam, which of course later became New York City, Dutch settlers brought with them the idea of observing not the 25th of December, but St. Nicholas's feast day on the 6th of December. St. Nicolaas, his name in Dutch became Sinterklaas and then Santa Claus. So this is how the name change happened. Of course, lots of children in the UK call him Santa now because of American TV and films, but usually it was Father Christmas here and Santa Claus in America. And here we can see this image of this Father Christmas figure looking very patriotically American, actually. And then we get on to a late Victorian image of Father Christmas in a rather spectacular green and white. I think that coat would be marvellous. I'd love that. Looking very much, as if he's a descendant of John Leech's Father Christmas in his green robe. And then I'm actually slightly cheating here because it's 4 years after the end of Queen Victoria's reign. But this is a 1905 Father Christmas in blue and white. And you can see what a difference there is from the images of Father Christmas that we see today. And this is when we get on to the Father Christmas or Santa Claus that most people recognise today. As I say, there were a couple, but I think literally just a couple of red and white Father Christmases in the 19th century. And then this Norwegian American artist called Haddon Somblum was approached by the Coca-Cola company, who said, we want an image of Santa Claus in Coca-Cola colours. And this is the iconic image from 1931 that changed the way that Father Christmas, Santa Claus looked all over the world, which is why if you see children today, they will only recognise Father Christmas in red and white. But of course, if you're actually putting on a Victorian production, it should almost certainly be green and white or blue and white at a pinch. Now I'm going to just share with you some of the games that people might have played. Snapdragon, I really wouldn't recommend playing this at home, particularly if you have fancy long sleeves or anything flammable on. So for the game of Snapdragon, Victorians covered a plate with raisins and nuts and doused them with brandy until they were well and truly soaked with brandy, which is of course flammable, and then they would set the brandy alight. And small children were encouraged to reach into the flames and get as many sweets and nuts as they possibly could. It seems quite extraordinary, but that was a very, very popular game. In fact, Lewis Carroll joked about it in Through the Looking Glass by turning the game into a creature. He wrote, "Look at the branch above your head," said the gnat, "and there you'll find a snapdragon fly. Its body is made of plum pudding, its wings of holly leaves, and its head is a raisin burning in brandy. And what does it live on? Frumenty and mince pie." Frumenty was a kind of Christmassy spice porridge. "Frumenty and mince pie," the gnat replied, "and it makes its nest in a Christmas box." Examples of some other games played by the Victorians: charades, and I Love My Love, and 20 Questions, the kind of things that appear in A Christmas Carol. And they also got together to make their decorations. Now, I shamelessly stole this last year. I took this picture at the Jane Austen house in Chawton. For those of you who have been to Hampshire in the UK, you may have been to the Jane Austen house. Beautiful, beautiful place. And they would get together and make all of these decorations. These ones are actually made out of books. And they would put together paper chains, cut out shapes to put onto the Christmas tree, dry fruit and things to put them onto their Christmas table, their Christmas tree, and have all of these things hanging down over a nice bubbling fire that was kind of, obviously going to set fire to the paper chains and all the greenery. But I think Victorian households weren't really aware of health and safety. Charades, by the way, is mentioned in Vanity Fair as well as in Jane Eyre. Now, when we get onto games played in Christmas Carol, of course, famously we have Blind Man's Buff. And this was one of the many Victorian Christmas games that allowed people to not only mingle with members of the opposite sex, but to touch them. If you think about Topper chasing the plump sister, desperately pretending he can't see anything through his blind, but manages to find her all the time and spends a very long time touching her hair to work out her identity. Another popular game was called Squeak Piggy Squeak. And in this, the farmer they sat on a chair in the middle of the room and they were blindfolded. And then everyone else would come and sit on their knee. You can imagine how scandalous this was in the 19th century. And they would sit on their knee and have to squeak. And from that, the farmer had to work out their voice and whether they knew them. Other games were used to improve children's vocabulary. So I mentioned Love My Love. You'd start off with something like, "I love my love with an A because he is adorable. I hate him because he is aggressive. I took him to Anglesey. I fed him on anchovies," bloody, bloody, blah. And it would go on like this. And a similar one was the Parson's Cat. The Parson's Cat is an acquisitive cat. It comes from Acton and lives on apricots. And each letter of the alphabet had to be gone through. And of course, the person who got X was often somebody who would have to really try and find something elaborate to come up with. But these kind of things, long before days of the internet, the radio, television, were the way that families would all play together. Now, after reading A Christmas Carol, many people wanted to celebrate Christmas like either the Cratchit family or Nephew Fred. Though a lot of parents were not happy with all these games where everybody was running around, sitting on each other's knee and touching each other. Now, this Christmas wreath, I actually took a few years ago, just before the pandemic, actually in 2019, at Malton in Yorkshire, when I was there for the Dickens Festival. And I loved it because it was all made with no plastic or anything like that, a kind of very traditional wreath. Now, the very first time that a wreath would have been hung on the door like this would have been in the Victorian times. Before then, it wasn't fashionable to use them in your house. They were used except on the Christmas table, where they would be an Advent wreath. And it would be something that would be in churches mostly. So you would have the 4 candles for the 4 Sundays of Advent, and then the candle in the middle of the wreath that symbolized Jesus Christ. Now, when Victorians started to bring in all this kind of greenery, what they were doing was emulating their ancestors from many, many years ago. And something that Dickens remembered, although he wouldn't have had a wreath on the door when he was writing his earliest Christmas stories, and he wouldn't have had a Christmas tree, but he would have had mistletoe. And this again goes back to ancient pagan times, and we see it here above the fezziwigs. And in Dickens's first seasonal short story of 1835, which is entitled Christmas Festivities, in the story, a grandfather tells the grandchildren that he first kissed their grandmother when he was a boy under the mistletoe. It also gets talked about in Pickwick Papers. And this is something that Dickens would have grown up with. But this goes back to the idea of mistletoe being a sacred plant. You may know it's sacred to the Druids, the old religion of Britain, for example. But lots of parents in the Victorian age banned mistletoe in their houses. As you may or may not be aware, you're supposed to take a mistletoe berry off every time you take a kiss under the mistletoe. And so this was extremely scandalous. Once all the berries have gone, the mistletoe is not meant to be used as a kissing bunch anymore. And parents did not like the idea of their daughters being kissed under the mistletoe. Now, this is the carol that we know very well in England called In the Bleak Midwinter, which I don't know if everybody in America knows this. My American students often don't. But it's actually from a poem by Christina Rossetti, the great poet, and she called it A Christmas Carol. It was set in the early 20th century, 1906. Gustav Holst set it to music. It's a beautiful carol. If you don't know it, do look it up. It's gorgeous. But the word carol originally just meant a dance that involved singing. And by the early 1300s, this meaning had grown to mean a song that was sung at major Christian festivals, in fact, most commonly Easter. It wasn't until about the 1700s that it started to be thought about as a Christmas tradition. Beforehand, it was all Christian festivals, and I say predominantly Easter. By the late 1700s, people started to kind of really think of the local carols and to pass them on. Oral history was very much something that was being passed down through families and communities. And in 1833, a man named William Sandys published a book called Christmas Carols, Ancient and Modern. And this really energized their revival and made people in the 19th century really keen to kind of keep looking at how the Christmas carol could be kept. And they continued in popularity all through the 19th century. And then in the very beginning of the 20th century, just after the death of Queen Victoria, a composer and musicologist named Cecil Sharp, who lived in London. In fact, anybody who's been to London might know the Cecil Sharp House, which still is a centre for kind of folk music and dancing. He began a campaign to collect, document and save English folk songs and music, including Christmas carols. He felt that all of these things were being lost. This is how we get the Christmas carols we have today. So Dickens would have known some of them, but he wouldn't have known them in quite the same way that we would know today. And then I'm going to end with a little picture here that I think Cindy took, actually, of me with my fellow patron of the Dickens Museum last year when we were launching Victorian Christmas. And Miriam, as you may know, is not a fan of Christmas, but she does like this book, and she said it was really fun. And we've done a few events on it, and she loves the fact that Dickens is so associated with it. As you may know, she is a huge fan of Charles Dickens. So these are my two Christmas books. And just to say that if you're on any social media, these are my social media names and some of my books, including the ones that you're probably most familiar with, the Dickens titles. So does anybody have any questions? I haven't overrun, no.
No. Thanks very much, Lucinda. Could you stop sharing now?
Yeah. Yes, there we go.
And then we can see everybody.
Great.
That was absolutely terrific. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
I'm sure we all thoroughly enjoyed it, and there's bound to be some comments and questions from around the world. Who would like to kick us off before I comment on Scotland and Christmas?
Oh, please do. It's fascinating, Scotland and Christmas. Why don't you tell everyone, Eric? Because most people won't know.
Well, we'll see if my fellow Scots agree with me, but traditionally, I think New Year Hogmanay and New Year was celebrated more than Christmas. Certainly, my own father worked Christmas Day, and it was only after he'd worked at least the morning that we came home and celebrated Christmas.
Yeah.
But Hogmanay, I think, was a much bigger festival, and everybody was on holiday then. Would anybody? Anne, perhaps are you nodding? You're muted. Maybe you can all unmute yourself now, and we can chat.
Well, that's what my research showed when I was looking at it, at how just how incredibly different it was in Scotland from elsewhere in the UK. It's quite amazing, actually.
On the other hand, I mean, no, Dickens admired Walter Scott. Well, Scott's famous poem Marmion,
yeah,
which is about the Battle of Flodden, one of the disasters in Scottish history. But it is a big Christmas scene in it.
Okay.
It's medieval times, and it's all about Christmas being celebrated in the great hall, and
yes.
And the peasants are sent out to the woods to collect the greenery and the branches and so on that you were talking about to decorate the medieval hall. So that was Walter Scott's vision of medieval Christmas in Scotland. So,
but I think it did go through changes, didn't it, with all different kind of religious people coming in and out, because I think it was celebrated more in Scotland in the past, probably in the medieval times, and then lost more in the dissenters.
Wait, but that was 1809, by the way.
Marmion, but when he was writing about the medieval Christmas, so would that not have been correct?
He was writing about medieval times. Yeah. I mean, but he wrote it in 1809, which is the same year as your Jane Austen.
Yes, interesting.
Script, I think. Yeah. Anyway, I have other questions, but who else is going to come in now? I'm sure there's lots of comments.
I would like to go back to your illustration of the miners, of the children that were called colliers, and on that title page of the book, where you pronounced her name Gillis.
Yeah.
Why are all the children nude?
Because it was the conditions were so terrible down there. It was so stiflingly hot, but also the tunnels that they had to go through to kind of get the coal. It was adults and children. You just couldn't wear clothes. You'd probably suffocated. So you'll see there's one illustration of a man who's pretty much wearing a loincloth. I mean, it was horrendous conditions and stiflingly hot. I mean, awful. A really horrific. I mean, sadly, there are probably children in the world at the moment who are living like that. It's heartbreaking.
That's horrible. That is horrible.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Now, we've got a comment here that people can't unmute unless you change the permissions, Eric. That's why.
All right. Okay. My apologies.
I think you have to unmute everybody, and then they can choose to mute themselves. Yeah, Tim. It was. That's what Dickens said. He wept when he read that book. It was just such an awful thing to experience, to see what had happened to these children.
Okay. And I just wonder if he witnessed anything like this, or this inhumane, not just in coal mining, but in other facets. When children were used as laborers.
Oh yeah, I mean, absolutely. And of course, he himself, worked in the factory, but he definitely did. And there's a really heartbreaking story from when he was a few years later, when he went up to investigate a terrible disaster in the north of England, a coal mining disaster, and discovered that everybody who died when the mine had kind of exploded, the gases had all built up, their lives had all been kind of in the hands of these two little boys who were probably about 6 or 7 years old, who didn't understand why they had to keep opening and shutting the ventilation shaft. One of them had to open and so they just left one open and one closed and went to play football. And he said that they knew that that's what they'd done because they were discovered dead with the football with them. And imagine that, everybody in that mine being, having their lives in the hands of these two primary school age children. I mean, it's absolutely terrifying. The conditions were so dreadful.
They're 6-year-olds opening and closing the door for the wagons coming through. So they're 6 years old, sitting in complete darkness, having to open and close the door. I mean, it really was appalling.
Yeah.
And oh, sorry, Jean, then you come.
I was just going to say, it reminded me of Disraeli's book, Sybil, Two Nations. And there's a description of the women working in the mines, and they were naked, often down to the waist, and wore the leather trousers, through under which, between the legs, were the chains that attached them to the wagons, which is another horrific image, isn't it?
Wow, it really is. Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, I mean, it's just we're so incredibly lucky, and I know that we are just in very privileged parts of the world, and there are many people whose lives are intolerable. But you know, I hope that most people are much better off today. Francesca has asked a question about the traditional Christmas meat. I love she's asking a vegetarian. Goose or turkey, but actually, it would have been more likely to be beef. If you think about in A Christmas Carol. When the law, they talk about Mansion House, and it talks about the little tailor who had been fined for being drunk and bloodthirsty. I love that, drunk and bloodthirsty in the street. And he's stirring up the Christmas pudding in his garret while his lean wife and the baby sally out to buy the beef. So that would have been more traditional, Francesca. It's said that A Christmas Carol actually brought in the popularity of turkey. Whether that is true or not, I'm not sure, but that's what it's claimed, that more people wanted turkey afterwards. I have to say that I'd always thought this, and last year I had a lovely American woman come on one of my walking tours, and I did tell the people this last night because it made me laugh so much. She said, honestly, I talked about, you know, where Scrooge would have sent the boy to buy the goose, and she said only a male author would have thought of sending a huge, unplucked, uncooked turkey to a woman who didn't have an oven. And it always makes me laugh so much. But yeah, Francesca, traditionally it would have been beef, and some people would have had goose as well, but then turkey started to come in when they came over from America in the 19th century.
We've got a question from
most
Ken Lawton.
Most Americans have never had goose, never.
Right.
I haven't, so yeah, that's unusual. Kenneth has a question.
Ken,
Kenneth, you can mute.
you're muted though.
Have to unmute, Ken.
I'll ask you to unmute, that should come through.
Thank you, Eric. I mean, there was just an observation on your comments about Hogmanay. I think probably there was a bit of a class stratification. I think people who were working class would still work Christmas Day and would be given Hogmanay and possibly New Year's Day or half of New Year's Day off. And there's a big relationship with Hogmanay and the more pagan festivals like the Fireballs at Stonehaven and the Tarry Barrels, and you know, the Comrie fire festivals that pulled away the time off that the working man had. I think in the more upper class households, they probably celebrated Christmas more than Hogmanay.
Right. That's interesting.
Class festival.
Yeah.
My dad didn't get Hogmanay. He got New Year's Day and a few days afterwards in Dundee. But he didn't get Hogmanay. My mum cleaned then.
Wow.
Had to clean. To get the house absolutely clean for the new year.
People cleaned for the new year, that's right. I'd forgotten that.
And that new year, on Hogmanay, you opened the back door to let the old year out, and then in the very early hours of the new year, you opened the front door to let the new year in.
The lump of coal.
Yes, the coal.
Yeah, the man had to come in with a tall, dark-haired man had to come in, and if you didn't have
Can
dark
you explain to me why coal? I've always wondered why coal.
But it was for keeping a warm house.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Didn't they bring bread? Didn't they bring bread?
Does it relate to Schwarzer peat? Is it black? And
Yeah.
the blackness
I wonder.
is
You would
symbolic.
have peat if you were in peat area.
I
But
did
in
first
Dundee,
footing.
yeah, but in Dundee they also had the herrings, and so you had your old herring barrel, and you used up the leftover ones at Hogmanay. You dressed them to look like people, right? A fish. You dressed a fish to look to look like a fish, to look like a person. And the ladies and things, you made wee skirts for them and things. And you took these around when you were first footing. And you can still get these in the fish. Pardon?
Are you making this up?
You can get them in the fishmongers on Hogmanay.
Wow.
I went to a class once where the leader had wooden little fish, and we made skirts and bonnets and things for them. And then she said, you see, but this is the ridiculous thing. If I take all the leftover fish from my barrel and deliver it round the houses when I go first footing, everybody who comes to my house then takes their old fish and brings it to my house. You know?
There's an interesting observation. Oh, sorry.
Never heard of that one.
No,
No, I've never heard of that.
Ladies across Scotland, obviously.
The dressing of the head. Well, and I guess,
in our
every
fishing
small
port.
community, now we're used to every community being able to do this, but in the past, people had their own traditions that might not have even been recognised 5 miles down the road.
Yeah.
Kathy has put a really interesting thing in. She says, part of your talk reminded me of a bakery here in Philadelphia where people stand in long lines to have their turkeys baked overnight for their Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners. Do you mean now, Kathy? That's fascinating.
It is interesting.
Wow. I don't know. I want a bakery that's baked bread in the same oven that turkeys have been baked. I'm just saying that, putting that out there. I'm going to avoid that bakery if I go back to Philadelphia. I think that's quite fascinating. Gosh, because people don't have big enough ovens. Is that why?
Yes.
Yes.
I think so.
Gosh,
Take a look at Tim's question prior to Kathy's. Take a look at his. So, would the baker have had a big enough oven?
I'd imagine bakers would have had very big ovens. Yes, I mean they, if you think about how much bread they were having to produce, yeah.
Yeah.
And baker's oven is almost more like a kiln, isn't it? Tim, what did you want to say?
I was going to talk about apples and wassail. You mentioned in Pickwick Papers in Dingley Dell, they had wassail, and he mentions apples bubbling about in it, bubbling about in the wassail. And that's a sort of pagan thing too, I think, which was Dickens referred to in 1832 or 3, whatever it was, 1838, but not, I think, in Christmas Carol. Is the wassail in Christmas Carol? I forget.
No, the wassail was the name of the child in Ben Jonson's play. So that was 1616. Yeah.
Right. But wassail was a much older tradition.
Much older. Yes.
At that time of year, and possibly associated more with Twelfth Night than with Christmas.
And well, you have to think that in Dickens's time, Twelfth Night was part of Christmas. So we differentiate the two, but Christmas was 12 days. I mean, that's really what Dickens would have seen. Yeah.
You're not really supposed to take your Christmas tree down until 12th night.
No.
But shockingly, some people do.
I know. And you know that in many parts of the world, they leave their Christmas decorations up till Candlemas, which is the 2nd of February.
2nd of February. Mm.
Yeah, which when I worked in Guatemala, and I thought, do they just keep lights up all year round? But I think the reason it stopped in the UK was it was considered too Catholic. But lots of parts of the world, they still keep their lights up until the 2nd of February, which is actually such a lovely thing when it's miserable and cold and grey and dark. I think the 6th of January is the most depressing day of the year when all the lovely lights come down.
When I was, can I say something in my turn? But when I was a child in South America, on the 12th night, the children went to bed, and when they came down in the morning, all the decoration, everything had gone, but the 3 wise men had taken them and leave a small gift for each child as a kind of consolation prize. So although it was a sad day, they get an extra little present. Yeah.
Because in Spain they do that, the 3 Kings Day, and it's a really big thing. Yeah. Interesting. And Francesca, I like this. Even the Nativity, with all its characters, is a mixture of images that are Christian but also come from a much older tradition and mythology, which is fascinating, Francesca. Thank you for that. Yes, that's really how lovely to see Francesca here, I have to say. I've seen you since Italy.
She's a regular. She's a regular with us.
So nice. Sending a hug.
A song before the next person. Did any of you I used to hang up a stocking. Well, I still do,
Yeah.
hopefully. But I used to get an apple in it.
Oh, we always got a satsuma. The satsuma
always
was
got an apple in it.
always in
Satsuma.
the toe of the stocking. Yeah.
That's right.
I don't know about Dundee. Did you get that in, Anne?
Yeah, we got both an apple and a satsuma.
Yeah,
Did you not get a dressed fish?
Pardon?
Didn't get a dressed fish in your stocking.
No, no. Well, maybe the older folk did, but no, we didn't.
Any other questions, comments,
Tim's got his hand up.
experiences? Oh, sorry. Sorry.
I'm sorry.
Jean first, then Tim.
I just wanted to ask Lucinda, would Dickens have had, Dickens's children had Christmas stockings?
Oh. You know, that's a really interesting thought. I don't know how much they don't talk about that. They talk about having one present. Yeah. Cindy, do you know anything about that? I think you have to unmute.
Yes, no stockings. That came later.
Yeah.
Came later.
Right.
I mean, the tradition of a Christmas stocking is a very, very old tale, but I've never read about people actually having them until the 20th century. Talked about as being a traditional part of Christmas, but not in the same way that we think of them. It's the story of St. Nicholas. And when they celebrate St. Nicholas's Day, they tend to have little chocolate Nicholases and things, and Krampus. You know, in Austria, they have the Krampus, which is this terrifying devil figure who comes and tells naughty children if they haven't sorted themselves out by Christmas. There's all these different traditions that come in.
We still use that one.
Yeah.
One less Christmas present.
So someone said, where does the stocking tradition come from? It comes from the story of St. Nicholas many, many years ago. There was a man who was so poor, he was going to have to sell his 3 daughters into prostitution. And so St. Nicholas heard about this, and he was a bishop, and he went and he left presents of money for the daughters so that the family could be saved. And then many years later, that kind of morphed into money being thrown down the chimney or through an open window or through a chimney, and they'd left their stockings up to dry. They'd washed their stockings and left them up to dry. The money landed in the stocking. There's loads of different versions of it, but it basically comes from the original origin of St. Nicholas. Yeah.
Just before we come to Tim, apologies for hogging the show, but Clement Moore's was the night before Christmas, which is 1823.
Yes. And
it doesn't mention Santa Claus. It's St. Nicholas. St. Nicholas. Called a visit of St. Nicholas, and at one point he says, St. Nicholas is very small. He talks about a miniature sleigh and a very tiny man, and he calls him Saint Nick. We knew immediately it was Saint Nick.
Yeah. And it's such a fascinating thing, because that's the year after Washington Irving wrote The Keeping of Christmas at Bracebridge Hall, after he came to England with his sister. And you think that was a big influence on Dickens. He was only 10 when that came out, and he loved Washington Irving. So all of these things will have had a connection.
Come together,
A Christmas Carol, but it's fascinating how that just really captured the imagination in the way that no previous one had done. I'm really sorry, but I actually have to go in a minute. I'm so sorry.
Well, I think you've given us huge value.
I've got to be somewhere at 9 o'clock. I'm very sorry.
It was wonderful talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Take care. And I am doing an event for the Dickens Museum, the hybrid event on the 19th of December, if you want to sign up for that. That's the middle of the day, so it's early morning very early morning in California. But I think it's 1 o'clock here. But yeah, please do. And take care, and hope to see you all soon.
Thank you so much, Lucinda. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucinda.
And a happy Christmas when it comes.
And a happy Christmas to all of you too.
So Merry Christmas.
Thank you.
Well, that was great, folks, wasn't it?
Yeah,
that was great.
Really good. Really, really
Eric,
good.
we had a high of 74, and we still have great comments and observations in the chat if anyone would like to stay and discuss them. We have some really nice
again,
ones.
Jim.
Well,
Say again.
Yeah, we still have some great comments and observations in the chat if anyone would like to stay and go over those. Chris and Jesse and Tim and
Tim, you had you were about to start a question when I cut you off,
Well,
Tim.
yeah, but she's gone now. No, but what I had heard a lot about how Queen Victoria absolutely despised Twelfth Night because she felt it had descended into nothing but debauchery. And not only was she disgusted with it, she abolished it. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. You know, Lucinda alluded that she just discouraged it. But I have heard that she abolished it because she was so disgusted with what it had come. Does anyone have an authoritative?
She would have no authority to abolish it.
No.
She could discourage it, but I mean, it was not in her gift to abolish it.
Okay. That's what I had always been under the impression of.
Constitutional monarchy in UK.
Okay.
That's right.
Chris says, you know, and Chris is our Broadstairs friend, as noted in the chat. After our Dickens disclaimers finished their dramatic reading of A Christmas Carol in Broadstairs, a gentleman came up to me and said, "Thank you, now Christmas has started." Every year the audiences identify with this wonderful story, and it never fails to confirm what Christmas is really all about. Great talk.
Absolutely.
And Jesse notes, we got an apple and an orange. In New Jersey, we were told our grandparents would give our parents one or the other if there was enough money. They were growing up in the 20s and 30s.
Yeah.
And Tim has a great note on Twelfth Night. Concerning Twelfth Night, we noticed what appeared to be chalk graffiti on old door frames in the Grand Town Hall of Duisburg. They were in fact the initials of the three kings inscribed there every year.
Yeah.
I never knew about this stuff. This is great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for all of you that have contributed this valuable information.
Yeah, we've learned a lot tonight. We really have.
Yeah. And if you missed it, we had a high attendance of 74, Eric. 74 people online.
And that's cameras. That's cameras, Tim. There was some doubling up. So I think we're probably near 80. But any other comments when we go Annabelle?
Yeah.
Annabelle.
Even here in New Zealand, I remember as a child